Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to In Focus program brought to you by Uongozi Institute. My name is Rekaza Mukandala from the University of Dar es Salaam, and tonight I'm going to bring you a conversation with Professor Peter van Nieuwkerk from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, School of Governance, and we are going to discuss peace and security in the SADC region, that is the region which consists of 16 countries. Karibuni sana. Welcome, Professor, to Dar es Salaam, to Tanzania, and today we are lucky that we are going to discuss issues of peace and security in your region. So to start off our conversation, why is peace and security so important for regional integration, especially within the SADC region?
So good evening, and thanks for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to visit Tanzania, a beautiful country, and an important member of SADC, historically and I think in the future. Yeah. So the question of that people ask, it looks like there's peace in our region. Why should we be worried about peace and security and not talk about economics or trade or so? Well, you know, allow me to begin by saying that the African Union developed a grand vision called Agenda 2063. And there's a beautiful phrase in there that says, one day Africa will be integrated, prosperous, peaceful, driven by its citizens, and prominent on the world stage. It's sort of a vision that we aspire to and working towards. The assumption in that vision from the African Union, and I think many share that sentiment, is if your country is not at peace, if there's instability, unrest, violence, crime, it's very difficult to develop. So stability and peace and security are preconditions for sustainable development. And that is something that I think every member state in SADC aspires to. Some are more successful than others for historical and other reasons we can discuss if you want. But the bottom line is, if you don't have peace and stability, your prospects for development are hobbled or held back. We see that even inside our own region, there are some countries that are struggling with peace, and so the development doesn't take place. Which means our political leaders, our academics, our researchers and analysts, and people on the ground, citizens, need to pay very close attention to this thing of peace and security. We need to strive towards it. And it begins with the individual. Some of our countries, if you will allow me to say, is racked by crime and criminal violence. That's a form of instability. Peace and security doesn't mean the absence of war. It means the presence of stability and justice for all. And there's our challenge.
Okay. Now, looking at scorecard during the last 15 years, how have the issues of peace and security been handled or addressed in our region?
Yeah. So we come from a past, from a history during the Cold War era. And I think the people who are watching this program who are youngsters, we need to remind them that the Cold War era was a time in our history between the end of the Second World War, the 1940s, up to the late 1980s, where there was an ideological war, if you want, between the East and the West, between the Soviet Union, the socialist camp, if you want, Cuba, East Germany, China, and then the Americans and the Europeans, primarily. Some of our countries took a middle road. They wanted to be non-aligned and pursue their own path to peace and security. But in that context, in Southern Africa, there was a struggle for independence to get rid of colonialism and apartheid. That was a big struggle which required some countries in the region to work together under the flag of the frontline states, which is the precursor to the Southern African Development Conference, as they say, SADC with a double C, that forced the region to come together and work together to get rid of colonialism, apartheid, oppression, violence, and being used as a proxy by this side or by that side in a bigger ideological struggle. That's the origin. So we come from a violent past. The region worked together, and I would say because of visionary leadership, including from your own country, former President Julius Nyerere, Kenneth Kaunda, Sam Nujoma, and others in the region, President Mugabe and others in the region, played a very significant role in bringing together a form of cooperation to overcome the scourge of racism and colonial oppression. Once that happened, in the late 1980s, we moved into a new era. We could now relax a little bit and focus on South Africa is now post-apartheid, it's a democracy. The question became, how do you bring this big economic giant into the fold of the region and make sure that we cooperate to the benefit of all? And in that sense, it was a big breakthrough, it was a positive development, it was a great success, because the region didn't end up fighting a war against South Africa. When apartheid ended, South Africa entered into the regional family of nations in a peaceful manner. That was positive. It doesn't mean that conflict and war disappeared from the radar screen. Not very soon after South Africa became independent or found its democracy, in the very same year when Mandela was elected the president, there was a genocide in Rwanda. Then people say, but that's Central Africa, why should we worry? There was a spillover effect into our region. Even Tanzania and others picked up refugees. And there's a big problem with the DRC, where two major wars were fought. And in fact, that fighting in the eastern part of the DRC is not finished yet. There's still violent conflict. We are spared the scourge of violent coups where the military come and take over in our region. We have a different culture. Our civil-military relations is more stable. But still, in Lesotho, small country surrounded by South Africa, there are problems with the civil-military relations. So that needs attention by the regional bloc, by SADC, mediation. Madagascar, a bit of instability as well. That needs attention. Which means, for SADC to prosper as a region, economically, for individuals to have job security, income security, prospects for a good life, it means that these conflicts that flare up from time to time need to be contained and managed quite professionally. And that's why we have a SADC secretariat to do that on our behalf.
And what do you say, what's the prospects for peace now in Mozambique? They've reached now an accord between Frelimo, the government, and the Renamo.
It took a long time.
Yes.
You know, my view is that when Frelimo and Renamo made peace in 1992, it was an incomplete arrangement. Because we realized then that it was just putting a plaster on a deeper problem. Renamo, for example, didn't demilitarize and demobilize. They didn't trust the ruling party, and they kept their weapons in the bush, and they were hesitant to participate and hand over fully to a democratic process. The ruling party itself was in the throes of a major change ideologically, moving away from socialist ideals to some form of democracy and free market system. Difficult transition, like we know from the Russians, because in the process, corruption can easily take hold. So it was an unstable period for Mozambique. And Renamo continued to remind Mozambicans of the incomplete process of transition. The deep wounds of civil war remained. And I think arguably only after the death of Afonso Dhlakama and the rise up of a new generation of leadership in Renamo and Frelimo was there the window of opportunity opened for a renewed effort to bring more sustainable peace to the country. It's a good sign that they've moved this far, but we must hold our breath or maybe support the Mozambicans in the quest for good governance, corruption-free governance, and then inclusive governance. even if the situation turns into Renamo controlling some provinces, Frelimo controlling other provinces, this should be allowed under a democracy, and they should be able to find each other in parliament and have the debates on the floor instead of in the bush. So under those very difficult conditions, and let me add quickly that we are also seeing the scourge of fundamentalism moving into our region. And you find forms of terror or terrorism, if you want, violent extremism, taking hold in parts of our countries. That is complicating the matter, which means the SADC Secretariat has an even bigger job to ensure peace and security.
Mm-hmm. Now, we all know now, of course, almost all the countries, they are under multi-party political competition with periodic elections. But in some instances, these have been a source of conflict and disagreements, and at times resulting in the loss of lives. How do you see elections and their dynamics in our region?
Yeah. So the SADC organization has gone out of its way to develop a culture, a set of values and rules by which the member states, there are 16 member states in SADC, can compete in elections, but peacefully, and for the losers to accept the outcome, or to be incorporated in some form of joint government somehow. This is democracy promotion. I would argue that this is a set of values that all of us in the region, if not the continent, strives for. It's the best form of conflict management, democracy, and having the debates in parliament instead of outside using violence. Now, some countries with their complicated political histories find it difficult to adjust. So you've come from an era of one-party system or a ruling party system, a socialist regime for decades. To make that adjustment is quite tough. In a context where poverty is prevalent, resources are scarce, and where the dynamic is if you win a seat in government, you are secured of a salary or an income or a position. It means that winning the election becomes all-consuming. Those who lose elections then do not accept. And then they use many tricks in the book to dispute the outcome, sometimes resorting to violence. But I must say on balance that I think we are learning fast that how to accommodate losers in the democratic race. We've got systems, a special courts, the legal system. We might even wait to announce final results until such time that all those who challenge the results have been adjudicated by a legal system or by a court in a special way. So we develop tolerance. And I think there's something to be said for a political system which is not winner takes all. Some form of proportional representation that allows smaller groups in society to have voice and agency inside the house where the debates take place. Let's accommodate minorities. I think that is the best way forward. We are learning to play this game quite fast.
Yeah, of course, and I think these special seats, for example, special arrangements for women, increasing gender balance, have also helped. But in the same vein, economic inequalities and poverty are, of course, some would say increasing in many countries in our region, even with positive growth in terms of GDP and so on and so forth. How do you see the issue of inequality and injustice and economic exclusion in the region, and to what extent is this a threat, or it might be a trigger for conflict in our region?
You know, Prof, this is the biggest threat that faces the region, if not the continent. In fact, let me be bold and say that our threat is not a military one. or an outside force that wants to intervene or invade physically, harming us. Our response is not to build up the military or the army or buy more tanks or helicopters, spending money there. No, 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 no. We live in an era of globalization and growing inequality between North and South, but also inside countries, within countries. So this capitalist system is producing winners and losers. If we as Africans do not adjust to the dynamics of the free market system, rapid globalization, and the digitization of the economy, which some people call 4IR, the fourth industrial revolution, then what awaits us is violence and conflict, because those who lose economically, who become more marginalized, will not find any other way to air their grievances but to take up some kind of physical resistance. It is the challenge of our century. It is the challenge to the leadership of the continent and our region. It is made even more dramatic by the understanding that the majority of our people are young and younger. So some academics call this the youth bulge. It's not a nice way, it's like, not a nice way to describe it. Yeah. What they mean is, in your society, half the people who live here are below the age of 25. Yes. They are looking for education, they are looking for jobs, they want to be entrepreneurs. If our political elite, which for some reason in Africa tends to be much older, so the president is 70 years old, and doesn't find a way to accommodate the aspirations of the next generation, he will be swept aside by forces of history. And my prediction is the Arab Spring that happened in North Africa might come and visit us in the rest of Africa if we do not find innovative new ways of accommodating the legitimate expectations of our young people for a better life. So we have to adjust our systems.
Yeah, that's very true. Let's now turn to what is called xenophobia. You know, that's where it's prevalent. I think a few days ago there was something going on in Soweto. Of course, it creates fear and impacts negatively on the movement of people, goods, and services, which are very basic for integration. So, what do you think are the causes of this phenomenon?
Look, the first point to make is that it happens. There are some politicians who are denying, because once you say that it exists, you are forced to take stock and take measures. So in my analysis, it's a form of a response to inequality and economic pressures. So in the very same Soweto, I live in Johannesburg, it's right next door, it's close to my front door. I understand that many of my citizens, my fellow South Africans, are also just above the poverty line, eking out an existence. What they find is the influx of people from elsewhere on the continent, Asia and elsewhere in the world, looking for a better life in Johannesburg, Egoli, place of gold, a mystical place where you will find fortune. Now what happens is competition for resources, for space, to set up your little spaza shop, to access social services, because people who run away from conflict and violence elsewhere, they bring their families, their children, the babies, they use the clinics, the schools, social services, and so on. So the competition now increases. Some of them are undocumented for a variety of reasons. They ran away from conflict, they couldn't be processed properly. Others make use of corrupt practices to find their way into Johannesburg or South Africa. Now, if you put this picture together, it creates a bit of a tension. Sometimes it boils over because I think we also have politicians who are stoking the fires of xenophobia, the hatred of the other, the hatred of the foreigner. So unfortunately, I have to admit that in my society, but perhaps other countries as well, there's a narrow form of nationalism. It's my country, it belongs to me. I don't want you to come, unless if you bring money, like a tourist. Don't come here and look for a job. Don't take my job at the university. It's competition. I'm going to look after myself. You must stay away. It's a very unfortunate culture that is developing not only in South Africa, but in parts of Africa, which I think requires cool heads and wisdom from our political leaders. And let me not say political leaders, from our elites. So you will find in religious communities, in civil society, intellectuals and academics, in the business, we have leaders. They need to educate. Let me stay with South Africa. South Africans need to better understand who are the visitors who come from abroad. They don't understand very well. There is a lack in our political education of what is happening in the region. Few people would understand Tanzania. They know it's in East Africa. They know there's Zanzibar. What else? They know Kiswahili, Hakuna Matata. They don't know more. They don't understand the complex relationships that was forged over many decades to bring freedom and democracy to the region. We need to rekindle a better understanding of our identity as Africans, and in the process build tolerance. I have high expectations from my political leaders to do this. They are too busy fighting for their own survival in the political system to spend time on this regional complex problem. Can I add one more thing about this? There's also a technical answer to this, because I'm talking about politics, a view of the world that says we belong, we share a history, etc. SADC has challenged the organization to develop a better system of managing borders. We're not changing our borders easily, because once you change borders, you invite the potential for conflict. Sudan split in two. The next thing that happened, there was a civil war in South Sudan. It's a dangerous precedent. What I mean is border control. So you want people, goods, and services to flow where the economy requires. Tourism, cultural exchanges, traders, family, all of these things, very important. It's normal trade across borders. But also we know that people are abusing borders to smuggle stuff in or out, to even smuggle people and children and women across borders. We need to manage our borders collectively as a region much better. So when people run away from a conflict here and they want to come to relative stability here, let's find them at the border, process them, document them, and give them the support that they need. Because after all, we signed up UN treaties to make sure that the human rights of refugees and asylum seekers are respected and protected. So there's much work to be done on both levels.
That is true. Of course, what is also not, it's known but not appreciated, especially by people at the grassroots, talking about South Africa, is that there is lots of movement of South Africans into African countries. And I think there was a case where there was an attack on Nigerians in South Africa. And I think the Nigerians wanted to shut down some of these South African companies. You're going to travel this afternoon, the South African Airways flight will be full of South Africans. I mean, there is a lot of movement. There is a lot of movement of South African capital in many African countries. But all these are not known, so the impression is that it is a one-way traffic. When in actual, in the real sense, there is a movement to and from South Africa into these other African countries. So as we were saying, I think this needs to be explained more so people can understand, can appreciate. And of course, that is the whole meaning of integration anyway, and you want this free movement of goods and services. But of course, as you are saying, that it needs to be regulated. It's known, it's recorded. And people should not see a threat, and see this as a threat, but actually as an opportunity. Yeah. But reflecting on the global experience, are there lessons, good lessons, from other regional blocs that SADC can learn from others to promote regional integration in the region?
You know, when I cast my eye globally, I see communities organizing themselves in a similar fashion, coming together to integrate, to tackle common problems jointly, to develop a regional identity, and by doing so having better voice or agency internationally. So if we as a bloc go and negotiate with the Chinese for better trade relations, 16 voices stronger than one, that kind of logic. It applies elsewhere, but other regional blocs are in trouble as well. The biggest and the boldest one, the European Union integration project, is creaking at this, it's straining. The UK is wanting to leave. They are fed up with the EU bureaucracy. It has enormous consequences. So this Brexit thing, it's worth a whole discussion on its own at another time, because I think it's coming. And it's damaging the European Union, the coherence, the integration. So the one lesson that I take from all of these dynamics elsewhere in the world, that I think we can do better as SADC, including ECOWAS, your EAC, IGAD, COMESA, and so on, is the following. We've not yet learned how to properly bring the key players into the project of regional integration. If it's state-driven and driven by governments or ruling elites only, that's one form of integration. You see them happy at a summit. That's one form. I think we need more. It doesn't help for governments at the summit to say to the private sector, you must be part of the integration project. Because government, because business, the private sector, entrepreneurs, traders, they have a different understanding of regional integration. They don't want to come to a summit. Civil society at large, including academics like you and me, intellectuals, the media, prominent members of civil society, also have an idea of regional integration. Just the simple thing of music, artists, poets, crossing borders to share their products. Some of our singers and artists in South Africa or in Tanzania, we are popular across borders. This morning, before you interviewed me, I was listening to a song, Vulindlela, sung by a Tanzanian woman in one of the venues. Beautiful. It's a form of integration, cultural and spiritual integration even. Now, how do we find each other? I think we still have to learn the trick of saying that integration is not only a state-driven project at the highest level. It means that all these forms of exchange between members of societies or communities must find expression. And it's the job of the SADC Secretariat and the elites to make the processes to flow more easily. We must allow business to do their business. We must allow artists to travel without hindrance. This thing of paying money for a visa, waiting at the airport, we need to make things easier for the common man and woman to find expression, their regional identity. When we do that, we'll be on a winning path. We'll be a force to be reckoned with.
Of course, you have increasing protectionism, the conviction that, which is counter to what we have been used to, that countries or nations are better off going it alone, negotiating better deals. I think that's what drives Brexit and so on and so forth. What is the source? Is that just frustration with the bureaucracy in Brussels, or is there something deeper driving this?
Yeah, I think there's an international trend away from open liberal politics to more right-wing, narrow nationalist forms of expression of identity. Can you imagine in Germany, which escaped the ravages of the Second World War, recovered, became a democracy, is the driving economy of Europe. Inside that place you find a revival of right-wing nationalism and new Nazism. And they win seats in their parliament. The same happens elsewhere in Europe. The same thing arguably is happening in America. America first, Trump. America first, us. Building the wall, keeping immigrants out, separating children from parents when they come from South America. This is unbelievable scenarios that we are beginning to see happening. It might have an impact elsewhere in Africa as well, where what was the impulse behind the genocide? This narrow form of self-identity that we do not belong together. You're in my space. You are eating my resources. Let me take care of you. We must do everything we can in a democratic manner to find a way to reduce, mitigate, counter these tendencies, and in fact find a way to accommodate minorities, because it leads to this kind of breakaway impulse. The Poles, some elements of the Germans, the British themselves. Well, let me say something about Brexit. I don't think that the British really want to run away from Europe. I think there were politics at play, and there was clever marketing to say to a disaffected group of Brits who did indeed had problems with the excessive bureaucracy of Brussels, making rules and regulations, extracting taxes from the wealthy Brits to help the Portuguese or the Greeks to build up their economy so they don't become a drain on the integration project. There was some kind of resistance to that. But it was exploited by politicians. We know them by now. The new Prime Minister is one of them, Boris Johnson. I don't think they know what to do once they leave the European Union without an agreement. They will be loosened on the waves of a very unstable ocean called globalization, international trade. And will they find themselves properly anchored to go forward as a nation? It's an open question. This is a lesson, I think, for us, who are also using the logic of regional integration and identity formation. When you have a disaffected group or country threatening to break away, let's do what we can to make sure they stay inside. Because remember my earlier argument, it's better to use 16 voices in a negotiation with a superpower than just one. I don't think we face a Brexit in SADC, as far as I can tell. But we do have, if I may say, a dominant economy, smaller economies, even dependencies on the dominant economy, and in this fast move to sign up an African free trade agreement, in my view, we might encounter problems going forward, because a big economy will tend to deindustrialize and suck opportunities away from the region into themselves. So the big economies, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Egypt. Smaller, less evolved economies, less diversified, will suffer from this process of opening up the borders. We need to find countermeasures to protect them from us, or to find the balance. And I'm afraid that we haven't worked out that formula yet. There's a lot of work that awaits us.
Of course, historically, not for SADC, but for example, in the East African community, you remember it once crashed in the 70s, and then it had to be recreated. And of course, other experiments have also had difficulties. So are there issues or ways that we should avoid, that SADC should avoid?
Sure. For me, a key issue that needs to be tackled by SADC, but it's also a delicate one. There's an elephant in the room. The name of that elephant is South Africa, the South African economy. So it's big, it's bold, it's aggressive, it's arrogant, it is moving its muscles. As the region, how do you accommodate this thing? How do you make peace with this dominant force? How do you persuade South Africans that it's in their interest to subsidize or support the development of smaller economies, such that you create markets which can then and allow the rules for traders here and there to exchange goods and services. That is going to require something beyond the forces of the free market or capitalism, because capitalism is driving this big elephant called South Africa. You have to mitigate the excesses of this economic dominance. And only in a regional context such as SADC, where you will have to negotiate a pact, an agreement, to reduce or mitigate or manage the impact of this thing. If we don't do this, then why would Lesotho or Eswatini, which is the new name for Swaziland, or Mozambique even be interested? Why should Tanzania stay in SADC if this is the future? When you said plane loads of South Africans that look like me, they're all coming here, taking up businesses. So I go for a dinner last night. It's called the Cape Town Fish Market.
Yes, right, yeah.
What is this? Where's the Dar es Salaam Fish Market restaurant with good wine? In fact, I believe you make wine yourself in Tanzania. So I'm drinking wine from Stellenbosch in Dar es Salaam. Exactly. So there's some work for you as well.
That's true. That's true. That is very true. Yeah, that is very true. Now, since SADC started, you've had changes, almost a generational change in terms of leadership. You know, from the Malimu, you know, you mentioned the Mkaunda and others. Now you have, you know, a new group of leaders. Do you see any change in terms of their commitment, in terms of their approach to these issues, in terms of their articulating the vision of this integration to the population? Yes.
You know, this is a very difficult question to answer. It's also a delicate one, because some leaders today pay lip service to the integration project of yesterday, which was driven by liberation politics, the ability to identify the enemy, to overcome the adversary, to find unity in purpose. We did that. We succeeded. Now, and I'm not blaming political leaders necessarily, because if you are the president or the prime minister of a country, and you talk to your advisors, you look at the world at large, you see the forces of globalization like a cloud hanging over your country. How do you respond? We are just talking about free trade and an agreement that everybody very quickly signed. What does it mean for your business community? What does it mean for your own people whose jobs you have to somehow secure? So I think the leadership that is emerging now is of a different kind, different education. They now live in a world of the digital economy, and they understand the world as a bigger place that's integrated and instantly accessible. You don't need to go to a meeting and take 5 days to understand what the Chinese wants to do with the Belt and Road Initiative. You find that on Google in 1 minute, or you talk to your advisor and you link up via Skype or some of these electronic measures to find out what is impacting on your country and how you have to protect yourself. Which means for some people, SADC as an institution is becoming redundant. What do you mean I have to go to Gaborone, fly there, stay in a hotel, knock on the door of the secretariat, wait for 2 hours, have an audience with the executive secretary? What for? When I can find the entrepreneurs and the innovators in my country who will open doors immediately. This is a big challenge. Even more so because sovereignty still plays a role, independence still plays a role, and I think many of our leaders are challenged by the youth and by their own citizens to find a better life right there and then. We want education, we want jobs, we want peace and security, we don't want corruption. Why should my leader go to a summit to find those things in the summit when I demand this immediately? And now we live in an era where if citizens' grievances are not addressed, they become angry. They become angry. And so the Arab Spring is a specter that will haunt us.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor. It has been a good conversation.
Thank you.
And I wish you a good flight back to South Africa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.